Hey everyone, welcome back to the second devlog for A Rogue's Odyssey. I just want to quickly thank everyone who watched and gave feedback in the previous episode. It was really helpful, so keep it coming. So starting off, I did some art for the title screen since I wanted to add it in the previous video at the beginning. I tried to do it in Sprite, but felt like due to the theme of the game I wanted some sharper lines, and with the help of some previous Thomas Brushes tutorials I found a few months back and an AI generated image, I got an alright result for now. That is, until I uploaded the previous video, and my talented friend from Cthulhian Games made me this awesome piece, so yeah. Now into coding. I wanted to have some kind of a special room to add other than the end room, so I spent almost an hour trying to make a function to find the furthest room from the end room, which sounded harder in my head for some reason. And after some poor attempts to use math, I realized that the distance to function exists. I facepalmed, and it made this task a breeze to get through. After that, I added some shadows to the player and to the enemies, and started working on getting some doors. I used this pixel art from Canos as a base and changed it to my liking, and ended up with this result, which I'm happy with. This was a pain to implement in game. Not gonna lie, it took me like 2 days to get everything working as I wanted. From the door design that was changed multiple times due to sizing issues, and overall just looking weird, to actually putting it in game and having the collisions work for both open and closed. And some more stuff I won't bother you with because most of it was just poor planning on my part. Next up, I started spawning enemies when I enter a room, and to do that, I also made it so I know what room I'm in. I made a current room variable that is defined every time I enter a room, meaning that this is handled by my camera detection zones. It sounds, and it is weird, but it's working for now, so until I find a better way, it's good enough. I then made a preset scene for the enemies in the positions I want, which I changed later on using a database for all the scenes and giving them a value for the level, which means I can call the spawn function with level 1 as the argument, and it will pick a random scene from the level 1 presets. I then made a function to check how many enemies remain, to make the room reopen the doors after all enemies were killed, and also mark the room as visited, so it doesn't spawn enemies again if I exit and re-enter. Every time an enemy dies, it emits a global signal that is connected to this code, and calls the function to check how many enemies remain. I should probably set this up better and just make the room preset itself emit this signal when all the children that are in the enemy group are gone, but I'll leave that for future me. Now onto some new content. I decided it was time to add a new enemy. A rat! I made a sprite and made some simple animations to see how it looked and made the code similar to the spider wing, except I added states for chasing and then to attack the player. I added a charge state that activates if this area 2D here detects the enemy inside, and after a bit it charges with faster speed and higher knockback if it hits the player. When the charge ends, I make it memorize the player's current position, so it charges there in a straight line and doesn't follow the player's position mid-attack. Then, after all this, I took a little break from coding and I added a rock and worked a bit on the UI to show the health and the utility bars. The HP is working as intended, and the utility is not implemented yet. But I'm thinking I'm gonna add like some grenades or stuns or flashes or something along those lines. I got this pack from itch.io and tweaked it a bit to fit the game better. This is probably not final, but for now it's good enough. Now, back to some coding. This is something I was dreading because I tried implementing it before and I just couldn't get it working. But I really need a way for my enemies to not get stuck on objects like the rock. I watched a few tutorials that didn't work for me. Some were outdated, others I just couldn't get the grasp of it, and some just looked like a whole lot of work, like A-star pathfinding and whatnot, until I stumbled upon this tutorial. Even though this is in 3D, the basis is the same with 2D. There's been a few changes in the newer version of Godot, but with some similar syntax, I got it working. Now, some more content. Every game has a slime, so yeah, I added a slime. Not sure if it's gonna stay or not, but for now I'm just adding some more variety into the game, and in some time I can have a better idea of what is or isn't good enough to stay in. I made the slime a slower and a tankier enemy that splits upon death into 2 smaller, faster slimes. I also tried to add a death effect with some particles, but I wasn't very happy with how it looked and I scratched it and tried to replace it with this death animation, which ended up not looking too bad. After this, I went back to the slime as I wanted to add a toxic ooze trail behind it. I made this simple sprite for the ooze and tried making a particle system with it, but it didn't work very well because as far as I know you can't really get collisions working and I need them to work to be able to damage the player. So the solution to this was basically just create my own particle system with code. That sounds more complicated than it actually is. I just made the ooze into a scene as an area 2D and made it spawn with a random scale, flip and rotation. I then added a timer to reduce the scale and disable the hitbox in a good timing to make it seem like it's fading away, after which it gets deleted. Then, in the slime's code, I just added a timer and a spawn ooze function that gets triggered every time this timer times out, instancing the ooze scene at the slime's current position, and ended up looking like this, which I think is fine. Up next, I wanted both the item room and the boss room to only have one connection, so I implemented that fairly easily. I just had to add the number of connections as a condition when finding those rooms. And I also made it so if there's ever a generation that has no rooms with only one connection, it randomizes the whole thing again. Now, I decided to add some more stuff as obstacles, and I wanted to go for some kind of a hole in the ground. I started off just making a sprite for the hole, which didn't look very good, and ended up spending like 1.5 hours building a tile map for the holes. Despite the time it took, I'm very pleased with the result, as it looks good and it makes setting up every room I want to have holes a breeze using auto tiling. Then, I also added some more rocks as scenes for variety, and should have a good amount of combinations already to have some more preset rooms. Alright, now I decided to find a way to not have enemies and objects just suddenly appear when you enter a room, and the easiest way I found was to just spawn everything at the beginning of the floor, and pause all enemies, and instead of just spawning them when I enter a room, I'm unpausing them, because they already exist. Finally, I decided to add a spawn animation, and I changed a little my death animation to have some blood particles. And I also reused the animation I made to have the last frame be a static blood pool, and just stays in the scene with a random flip position and a color range, to give a nice progression feel while we're fighting enemies in the room. I am now planning making various room presets, adding an item to put in the item room and just add a boss, so I can have a complete floor for now. Even if it doesn't have much variety, adding content into an already functioning level is probably a much better workflow than to just have a whole bunch of content and no structure in the game. So I'm expecting in the next devlog I can finally have a boss in the game. I'll have a very productive conversation with my good friend ChatGPT, and I'll try to find out what a good boss would be for my game. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed watching, and I hope that you learned something from this video. Till next time. Peace!